and welcome to this week's Jessica Recommends. And this week, as you can see, there's a bit of disarray going on behind me. I decided not to try and fix it. I am shifting all my shelves over. It's a whole thing. I'm moving the books. The books are being moved. So check it out. You can see my old footstool that I've had forever, my step stool. You can see all my books every which way. Enjoy. Um, but this week, we're going to be talking about fairy tales because if you didn't know, if you stumbled across my channel somehow accidentally, um, here you go. I'm Jessica Day George. I'm the author to date of 4 fairy tale retellings, and I am someone who has been working for years on another book that would combine all the fairy tale characters from Grimm's fairy tale and their children into one big, gory, awful story. So I love fairy tales, and I've already talked, I think, about how much I love East of the Sun, West of the Moon, probably in a previous video. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, of course. But first of all, to get the ball rolling, what am I reading right now? Right now, I just started today. I was lucky enough to score an arc of The Real Wish by Shamile Sayed Mendez, and gotta tell you, delightful. Cannot put it down. Probably going to be one of my best books of the year. I can already feel it coming. It's a middle grade book, slightly based on one of her own children, about a girl who begins having severe anxiety attacks, and she is a talented ballerina and ends up finding joy again in Irish dance. And since I am an Irish dancer, I managed to finagle a copy, and I am so excited. It is gorgeous so far. I love it. So that won't be out though for the rest of you until March of 2025, but I got it early and I'm loving it. So I'm reading that to myself. Reading aloud to the family is Impossible Creatures by Catherine Rundell, and another favorite that's going to totally become a favorite. First of all, look at how gorgeous this book is. It's illustrated, it's got sprayed edges, it's fabulous, and we are all absolutely loving this book in the family. Started a few days ago. Really great. I heard nothing but great things, and they are true. So that is what we're reading aloud. I'm also listening to the audiobook of The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo and really enjoying that as well. So I'm having a very good book week, let's say that. But let's talk about fairy tales. I'm, like I say, a huge fairy tale fan. My degree is in humanities, emphasizing comparative literature, which meant that I had to learn to speak 2 different languages, be fluent in them enough to take literature classes in those languages. And I picked Norwegian and German. And what I studied in those languages was their fairy tales, their folk tales, their mythologies. So Norse mythology, the folk tales of Norway about the trolls and things like that, and Grimm's fairy tales. I did whole classes that were just me and a professor where I read fairy tale after fairy tale in German and then went back to my professor and said, okay, this is what I think is going on in these fairy tales, or this is what I see with, like, here's the things that are happening with everything's repeating 3 times and all this stuff. So that's why I tell people, well, my degree is in fairy tales. It's in fairy tales and mythology, basically. So let's talk about fairy tales. If you do not want to read the original Grimm's fairy tales, which is very valid. A few years ago, my kids made me get out the big leather-bound complete Grimm's fairy tales that we have in English and read it to them, like cover to cover. It was horrible. I'm like, you guys, you're not gonna like this. And they got super into it because of the weirdness factor and everyone having their hands cut off all the time, usually women. And my kids got super into it, but it was almost like ironically, or like they were daring each other. And I'm like, this is nonsense. What I actually read to them when they were younger, before they became weird, cynical little people, was this one, the Random House Book of Fairy Tales. So if you're looking for a solid book of Grimm's fairy tales that has lovely illustrations and the fairy tales have been kind of PG rated. They've been censored a bit, or whatever you want to call it, bowdlerized, however you want to say it, so that they are acceptable to read aloud to a child who doesn't want to have nightmares for life. Then I recommend the Random House book of fairy tales. And you can find these, Random House does them with different illustrations. This is just the one that my sister always had that I have. The illustrations are by Diane Good, and they've been adapted by Amy Ehrenreich and Amy Ehrlich, and I really like this one. I love the art, and I think she does a really good job with the adaptation of the stories. If you want to traumatize your children for life, by all means, go out and find the complete Grimm's Fairy Tales. And everyone gets their hands cut off. You are looking also for great picture books. That are fairy tales. Endlessly Ever After, that just came out in the last year or so. Laurel Snyder, Dan Santat. This is really great, especially if you like choose your own adventure. As you know, I struggle with that, but I have actually been able to read every version of this. I think I do it with my kids' classes, and they love it, where you send little Red Riding Hood through the woods. She encounters other fairy tale characters, and you get to decide, where does she go? Does she follow the wolf? Does she help the three little pigs? All these things. The illustrations are gorgeous. The way the story is told are really fun. The options are really fun. So it's like, turn to page 63 if she goes straight to grandma's house, and all those things. And sometimes it's like, whoops, you died. Whoops, you died. Or like, oh, you get to live happily ever after. So this is a really fun one, came out a couple of years ago, that we've really enjoyed at our house. And again, it's really fun to do with a classroom, fun to do with a group of kids. And let them choose, go like, okay, do we want to do this or that? And let them vote. And then I would go back and let them pick other options and stuff like that. Rapunzel, this is a gorgeous retelling of Rapunzel by Sarah Gibb. The illustrations are just to die for. I mean, honestly, look at that. That's fabulous. So this is a beautiful edition of Rapunzel that I highly recommend. And then this is one of my all-time favorites, The 12 Dancing Princesses. It's retold and illustrated by Bridget Berger. And I actually stumbled across a matching game, and I love matching games, like where you just flip over the cards and match. I love to play those with my kids when they were littler. And we actually stumbled across a matching game right as I had written my version of the 12 Dancing Princesses, Princess of the Midnight Ball. We found this matching game, and we thought it was so great that the princesses also had flower names. And then came to realize, as we were looking through it, that it was from this picture book. And we found the picture book, my sister and I. And I also have like a little doll theater now with these people on them and stuff like that, because I love the art so much. And I love the way she tells the story. So this is a gorgeous retelling of the 12 Dancing Princesses with beautiful art, Bridget Berger. And I really recommend it. And then if you can also get your hands on the little matching game with the cards you flip over, it's super fun. There's a little dog, there's all the princesses, there's the flowers and things like that. It's a really fun one. Speaking of really fun ones, Goldilocks and the Three Dinosaurs by Mo Willems. This is super hilarious, of course. Notice the end papers are all Goldilocks and the other things. 3 dogs, 3 penguins, 3 oak trees. We got this signed a few years ago when he came to town and read this book. And having Mo Willems actually read the book, if you can find one somewhere where he actually reads the book to you, the way he does the voices is hilarious. One of the dinosaurs is a friend visiting from Norway, which is just super funny to me, of course. And it's got like every part of this book, of course, is specially done. The author picture, the end papers are all done to be really fun and to be a part of the story. And it's a super fun one to read aloud as well. Beauty and the Beast, done by the Minalima team, which I just love all the stuff that they do. If you don't know about Minalima, they do all kinds of crazy things, like in their books. There's not just elements that pop up, there's maps that fold out. There is a spinning compass in this one. This is an addition to Beauty and the Beast that is not only quite a long telling of the story, but also includes like all these 3D elements and cool things that you can go through and flip and open and all the things and maps that fold out and wardrobes and papers, stuff that you can play with in the book. So the Minalima editions of classic stories are really great. We have Peter Pan and the Jungle Books and all different ones, and this is Beauty and the Beast. And highly recommend them if you're like a book collector or you like cool things in your books, being able to unfold the maps and all that. Book that's based on a story that's really hard to find a version of. The Piper's Promise by Leah Sipus, part of her Sisters Ever After series. I was fortunate enough to get to read the manuscript to this. They asked me if I would look at it and see if I wanted to blurb it, and I came back with a resounding yes. I loved this book. I love the story of the Pied Piper, and you so rarely see it done as a book. And this is a great middle grade book with a really, really fun twist on the Pied Piper and the Rats of Hamelin story, which you, again, rarely see. Leah Sipes really enjoyed that. The other one that I don't have a copy of, it's out of print now, but I highly recommend, I read it several times as a kid, was What Happened in Hamelin by Gloria Skrzynski. That is a really cool, very realistic historical fiction set in Germany retelling of the Pied Piper that I really enjoyed as a little kid. Copies are out there. What Happened in Hamelin, really interesting. Books that are sort of all the fairy tales together. I'm, like I said, I'm working on one right now myself. And so I loved this, The Fairy Godmother by Mercedes Lackey, where a girl who, she is supposed to be the Cinderella for her kingdom. And her fairy godmother basically comes to her on the eve of everyone else going to the ball, her stepmother and her stepsisters, and says, listen, there is no prince for you in this kingdom. The prince, as you know, of your kingdom is way too young. He's a child. So they're not looking for a wife for him. You will be too old by the time he's old enough to be your prince. So you have the option to become a fairy godmother and go around to other kingdoms and make sure that other people's stories work out. You make sure that people guess Rumpelstiltskin's name. You make sure that Sleeping Beauty gets woken up in time and all these things. So she opts to become a fairy godmother. It is a super fun story, and it is also a romance novel. This was done by Luna Books, which I am so sad that they got closed down. It was an imprint of Harlequin that existed for a brief golden time. Really fun. They did a bunch of fun fantasy that had, well, now it would be called romantasy and it'd be huge, but this was probably 20 years ago or more that they sort of came into the scene was not ready for them, and they folded again. So this is adult. It's really fun and flirty, and then suddenly it's very much a Harlequin romance novel, if you know what I mean. And then it moves on with the story. But I thoroughly enjoy this and highly recommend it, The Fairy Godmother. But for you middle grade readers, this is for the moms, this is for the younger readers. We absolutely, my whole family loved The Hero's Guide to Saving the Kingdom by Christopher Healy. This is what happens after all the fairy tale stories. This is the princes. This is Snow White's prince and Rapunzel's prince and Cinderella's prince. It's their turn because they feel like nobody even knows their names. They just get called Prince Charming, right? Nobody understands their part in the story. And now some other things have come up. There's dragons attacking and some things like that. And so it's finally their turn to get out there and establish themselves as characters beyond Prince Charming. It's a trilogy. It's complete now. It was so hilarious. We all loved it. We passed it around the family. The Hero's Guide to Saving Your Kingdom is the first book and also the name of the series, I believe. Christopher Healy. Out of the Wild by Sarah Beth Durst. The first book is Into the Wild. This is the sequel, but someone has stolen my copy of Into the Wild. I would not have given it away. It was signed to me, and I cannot find it anywhere, and I'm pretty sure I loaned it to someone and they never returned it because people are awful. But this is the daughter of Rapunzel, and what she does, her adventures. It's like all the princesses and stuff, they have finally managed to break free of the enchanted forest and they're living normal lives in a normal town in the United States. But then stuff keeps happening from their past. A villain comes out, someone's handsome prince that was thought to be eaten by a dragon pops up again with amnesia, that kind of thing. And it's a really fun middle grade book. This girl kind of going around um, finding out who she is and what's her place in the world as the daughter of a former enchanted princess and stuff. Really a fun book, fun series, 2-book series. Um, and so I really love those ones that are sort of like, let's tackle several fairy tales at the same time. Ella Enchanted, the gold standard. Cannot believe that this was just a Newbery honor. I don't know what was the actual Newbery winner from that year, but I hope it was really good. I can't remember now because this book is so fantastic. I read this book. I mean, it came out when I was an adult and I read it as an adult. And I just remember thinking, like, this is glorious. This is the kind of book I would love to be writing. Ella Enchanted, and ignore the movie, whatever with the movie. Gail is just one of the world's best people and such a fine writer for middle grade books. And this is possibly her best, Ella Enchanted. And then for the young adults that like a Cinderella story, Marissa Meyer's Cinder. I fell in love with this book immediately when I read it. Oh my goodness. And this is the new paperback, which has cool stuff, but Cinder is set in the future and she is a cyborg. And so she doesn't just lose her shoe after the ball, she actually loses her whole foot, which I think there's a lot more going on. So that's not really a spoiler. That's just a small detail. But anyway, if you have not read Cinder, Cinder is fantastic. I could not have loved something more than I loved this. One of my favorite sort of lesser known stories that now is starting to pop up more and more is Snow White and Rose Red. I love this story, and it often, when people are looking at it because of the roses or things like that, gets mistaken for either Snow White or maybe Beauty and the Beast. It's not, it's a separate thing about 2 sisters, one dark-haired, one fair-haired, like in all good fantasy books, and a prince under an enchantment. And I just loved this story. I had like a little golden book or something as a kid with this story in it that I used to read over and over again. There were parts of it that were in rhyme. Basically, a bear is visiting them, so that turns out to be an enchanted prince. And so I sort of loved it because it reminded me of East of the Sun, West of the Moon, I think was what the appeal was for me. And this version by Patricia C. Reedy is really excellent and was part of a series that happened in the 90s, sort of a loose series, the fairy tale series, which was created by Terry Windling. And they basically got all these really well-respected fantasy authors to retell their favorite fairy tale in their own way, in their own setting. And Snow White, Rose Red was one of the first ones that came out, and I could not have loved it more. So great. And there was also Jack the Giant Killer, which did not get the same cover. I think they were trying to be a little more bad A or something, if you will, with it. Jackie is a woman living in it's part of Charles DeLint's series about Newford and the artists and people who interact, artists, musicians. If you don't know about his Newford books, it's sort of based on Ottawa, Canada, where he lives, and it's the artists and musicians and the street people there who are interacting with fairy, interacting with supernatural creatures regularly, sort of taking it in stride or completing quests for them. And Jack the Giant Killer, Jackie is a woman, and it was really cool, real fun. I read this as a teen and really enjoyed it and thought just Jackie was so cool. I loved her so much. And it was a really unusual take on Jack and the Beanstalk. The Nightingale by Cara Dalkey. Please excuse the fact that my copy of it is a used library copy that has definitely seen better days. It's all I could find, and I love it so much I had to have my own copy. Cara Dalkey's The Nightingale, based on Hans Christian Andersen's story The Nightingale, except it is set in feudal Japan. Kara's background is Japanese. The original story is supposed to be, I believe, China. So this is set in feudal Japan and is just so lovely, just beautifully evocative, reads like really good historical fiction. Now, there was one of that series, and I did have the cover that matched, that had the little border and the roses, but I read it so much that I have now had to put it in a safe place to preserve my original one that has my maiden name written in it in my very best cursive. But my all-time favorite, one of my favorite books ever, is Tam Lin by Pamela Dean, based on the Ballad of Tam Lin. Um, I love this book so much. It is set in the late 60s, early 70s at a little Midwest liberal arts college where young Janet starts to realize that the members of some of the faculty might actually be not humans. And there might be fairies involved, and there might be some of Shakespeare's original actors involved. And it's just all kinds of cool. And it's what I wanted college to be. I was so disappointed when I went to college and I did not immediately find all these people who love to quote poetry and Shakespeare all the time. And I didn't have a cool immortal boyfriend immediately, and it was very sad for me. So Tam Lin by Pamela Dean, this is the newer cover from Firebird Press that is an excellent cover. I love the original, but I also really love this one, Tam Lin by Pamela Dean. And then also part of that series, but I have a different cover, is Briar Rose by Jane Yolen, which is Jane Yolen's take on The Sleeping Beauty or The Briar Rose. And this one is set during the Holocaust and then afterwards, and is sort of told in flashbacks, and is really, really heart-wrenching, really beautiful take on Sleeping Beauty. And I just won't say any more about it, but if you read just one of the books recommended here today, really, and if you have not read Briar Rose, read Briar Rose. It's a gorgeous book. Oh, but speaking of books that tackle all the fairy tales, The Forest Grimm by Katie Purdy, or guess we have to call her officially Catherine Purdy. This was a really fun one, where people are just, this little village is just boxed in by the forest, and people have disappeared into the forest and not returned. And so this girl goes in. She goes in after her mother, after her missing friend, after all these people. It's just been too many people have disappeared, so she goes for it. And they are encountering people who are trapped in their stories. They suddenly believe they are Cinderella. They believe they are Rapunzel, and it is very, very much like very moody, very dark, German forest type of vibe and stuff like that. And it is sort of grim. It is the Grimm's fairy tales. It is what was happening with Cinderella, with Rapunzel, like the sort of the darkness in those stories. She doesn't pull back from it, but it's also very romantic, really great young adult novel. It's recent, and there is a sequel coming out soon, and I am very jazzed about that because this one was just beautiful. Let's talk about Beauty and the Beast. Let's talk about what the absolute gold standard for Beauty and the Beast stories is. Obviously, Beauty by Robin McKinley, her very first book. This, if you did not know, is what Disney used for the template for their Beauty and the Beast. And I will not hear anything against that. Like, that people arguing with me, oh, they didn't really. No, they totally did. And I know people who actually thought that it was a straight up adaptation, like they had bought the rights to do this. This is the story where she is obsessed with books and the Beast has a fabulous library. This is the story where she has a huge gray horse and she slowly teaches the Beast how to like get along with other animals, with the horse, with the birds in the yard. The servants are not turned into furniture, but the servants are there, but they just are like spirits. They're incorporeal. She can only hear them talking sometimes. So, beautiful clothes appear for her. A golden ball gown that she doesn't want to wear appears for her, and she doesn't really have, but she doesn't have like contact with the servants because they aren't physically there. So this is Disney's Beauty and the Beast. If you've ever wanted to read the book, it's also super romantic, very delightful. I'm jealous till the day I die that this was her very first book, when she was just like, I shall write a book. It shall be Beauty and the Beast, because it's perfect. And then years later, Rob McKinley was asked to write a short story that was a version of Beauty and the Beast. It was for a fairy tale anthology. And they said, listen, I know you did this before, but now, 20 or more years later, how would you tell that story again? How would you tell the story of Beauty and the Beast differently with, 10 books under your belt, 20 more years in your life? And she became obsessed with the idea and started writing it. And she never made it into the anthology because instead of just writing it as a short story, it ended up becoming a full-size book. People get contentious about this. They either, whichever one they read first, I feel like they were like, no, it's this one's better. No, that one's better. Rose Daughter is the result of that. It is very different. It is different to the point where you almost could take away the author's name and someone would be like, that was the same author. It's a very unusual take on the story, and I really love it as well. I don't think it's like a super perfect book that I want buried in my coffin with me, but it is excellent and I highly recommend it. Especially, I recommend if you're a writer reading both Beauty and Rose Daughter and seeing how she did that and made them two different books. It's very interesting. And on her blog, on her website, she has talked about both of them. And it's really interesting to see her talk about how Rose Daughter came about as well. And while we're on the subject of Robin McKinley, just real quick, she also did a book of fairy tales called The Door in the Hedge, which has one of the best retellings of the Princess and the Frog, or what is it now? The Frog Prince, I guess, is the actual not non-Disney title. But the Frog Prince is in here, and it's really cool. Just her the way she describes everything is really interesting and unusual. The very first story is actually about fairies stealing away a princess, and it's so good. And it's called The Door in the Hedge, and I read it over and over again. She has a version of 12 Dancing Princesses in here as well. That's very good. But The Frog Prince is my favorite out of there, other than The Door in the Hedge. Beauty and the Beast stories, though. The Fire Rose, which I absolutely loved. Again, Mercedes Lackey, part of kind of a loose series she did of fairy tale retellings. This was one of the first ones. It's my favorite, and it is set in early 1900s in San Francisco. And a young woman who is a school teacher is invited to cross the country to live in this elaborate mansion in San Francisco. She's initially lured out thinking that she's going to be privately teaching to children. And when she gets there, she finds out that no, all the owner wants her to do, the owner of this huge house, is read into one of those newfangled speaking tubes, like an intercom system basically, is to read day after day these huge stacks of books. And he is a magician who has turned himself into a beast. And as a beast, his eyes can no longer read writing. So he needs to get the counterspell. So he's having her read his books aloud to him. It's romantic, it's delightful, it has a really unusual ending, and it takes place right as the big earthquake happens. Love this book so much. Young adult, A Curse So Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. This is really wonderful. I love how she handles disability in this book. The main character has a disability and she is from our world, and she gets taken into this fantasy world with this strange curse on this handsome prince and all the trappings of a Beauty and the Beast story, but with a very interesting modern twist, strong romance, YA, so good. Loved Bridget's book. Now for something completely different, let's talk about vampires. I love to talk about this book. I talk about it every time I teach about fairy tales because this is a retelling of Snow White. It's a retelling of Snow White with a family of vampires. And I like to talk about it because this is a very subtle way to do a retelling. I was so far into this book before I realized that it was a retelling of Snow White and not just a vampire novel for teens. I am embarrassed. The fact that it took me so long to realize that this white-skinned, black-haired girl who had 7 older brothers had just fallen into a coma and been placed in a glass tomb, and I suddenly went, blink, blink, blink. Oh, she's Snow White. I felt so dumb. It's so well done. Alexandra Harvey is the author. I have loved every one of Alex's books. This one is particularly great. But it is the beginning of a series. It's the beginning of the Drake Chronicles about the Drake family. So Solange is Snow White in this one, very first one, Hearts at Stake. It's got everything you could possibly want in a YA vampire story. There are feuding vampire clans. There is a whole methodology to how people become vampires and things like that. It is super cool. I love it so much. I love her family. I love her. I love her brothers. I love her bestie who is human but knows all their secrets and is included in the family. It's a really fun world that she's created. I think they are in hilariously like the Pacific Northwest or something like that, sort of like Twilight. Maybe they're in Canada because Alexander Harvey lives there now, but I can't remember. But anyway, so it's got that sort of like, but I'm late for my, we have a vampire council, but I'm late for math class type of thing going on, which is really fun to me. So then after this, she went on and sort of tackled other fairy tales with each of the seven brothers. So there is a Beauty and the Beast, and there is a Sleeping Beauty. I absolutely loved the Sleeping Beauty story. I thought that one was so unusual. Um, this is this is actually it as well. I grabbed it too because this is a Sleeping Beauty retelling and called Blood Feud. Super fun, and she has done them all. So there are 8 there because there's Solange and then her 7 brothers, and everyone is a different fairy tale. All of them are great. So Alexandra Harvey's series, really fun. The Drake Chronicles. The Goose Girl. I did not know this story. I'm like, I mean, I knew of it and I maybe had read it at some point in German or something like that. But Shannon Hale's The Goose Girl was such a revelation to me when I first picked it up, because usually fairy tale retellings until that point that I had seen had sort of been either very much older, like the Fairy Godmother, like sort of older fantasy books that had maybe, you know, a little bit stronger rating, were not for kids at all. Or you see Ella Enchanted, which is middle grade. And I had not really seen something that was more YA, was more about a teenage girl, and just so beautifully written. Nothing sort of like gimmicky, like, you know, and that's why they call me Rumpelstiltskin or anything like that. Just like a really beautiful, reads sort of like really poetic historical fiction to me. And I didn't know this story very well. I sort of knew of it, that there was like a princess undercover as a goose girl was kind of what I knew about it. And the other twists and details of this story, and she brings them to life, and they were so unusual to me that I read this. I think I read this one time and then just went right back to the beginning and read it again because I'm like, how did she do that? It's so beautifully written if you have not read it. And then she did a story I'd never heard of, had never found anywhere, called Maid Maline, into this Book of 1,000 Days. And I loved this one so much. It's Maid Maline, or I think maybe The True Bride or something like that is the original story. I didn't know this at all. At the time, Shannon's parents were living in Mongolia. And so she set it there in sort of like, you know, 1,000 years ago Mongolia. So like the clothing and the food that they ate and the animals and all these things are from that time period and that culture. And it's really well done. And I really love this one as well. Book of 1,000 Days by Shannon. Uh, and speaking of Snow White Rose Red, here is a recent middle grade of that, Snow and Rose, by Emily Winfield Martin, who is also an artist. And this book gets special mention because not only does she put her own spin on the story, and it is for younger readers, it's not a romance, it's more about these 2 girls and their family, but it is fully illustrated throughout. This is a big, heavy book too. It's like really high quality paper and stuff like that. And it's just beautiful and so charming. Just like she created a fairy tale world. She makes you feel like you are in the fairy tale. Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik is a really gorgeous version for adults of Rumpelstiltskin, and is based on but also is very historically based with medieval Jewish people in Eastern Europe and their treatment and things like that. And so she sort of parlays it into this whole story about fairies and magic, but also has a very strong historical grounding in her family's history. And I loved it so much. Naomi Novik is a stellar author, and this is one of her finest books. Now, as you know, I do love Tam Lin, and this is another version of Tam Lin, and this is your moment of Diana Wynne Jones for this week. Diana Wynne Jones, Fire and Hemlock, a really unusual book. I just listened to the audiobook again. I hadn't read it in a few years. It's very startling, and it's a book that couldn't be written today because it starts out with the main character is very young. She is like 11 or 12, I want to say, and ends when she is an adult. And the whole time she has been sort of very, very slowly falling in love with the Tam Lin character, who is an adult when they meet. And it's not icky. I will say that. It is not creepy at all, but it can be seen as creepy now. When she wrote it, this would totally have worked, and it would seem romantic and stuff like that, and kind of a surprising twist towards the end and everything. But looking back now, I would not give this to a child to read now, but I would definitely give it to an adult or an older teen and be like, listen, this is kind of a product of its time, but it in no way is like inappropriate, let's say that. But it's a very unusual take on Tam Lin and has a very weird ending. A lot of Diana Wynne Jones's books have like almost these weird endings where you're like, were they simultaneously in Brighton and the fairy kingdom? And how did that work? And you have to really sit with them and think about it. And this is one of those. Now we're going to talk about my favorite here to finish off. East of the Sun, West of the Moon, as you may know, is my all-time favorite fairy tale. Close second is the 12 Dancing Princesses, but East of the Sun, West of the Moon is my hands-down favorite. I do not remember first discovering the story. I do not know where I found it, but I have a very vivid memory of reading that story over and over again in some picture book somewhere as a child. And there was something about it, the snow, the polar bears, the trolls, I don't know. So I wrote my own version. I worked on it for years. I decided I was going to do this when I was like 13. I took notes for almost 20 years before I finally had the courage to write my own version and hope I did it justice. So obviously I am always on the lookout for other versions of this story. One of the first ones I ever saw was East by Edith Patu. If I'm ever accused of plagiarism, it is usually because of East by Edith Patu, and that is fine. I appreciate that. Game recognizes game. This is a very, very good retelling of this story. But it if you are thinking like, yes, you totally stole that, most of the people are unaware that it is a story. They think that East is something that she created, the whole thing about him being a polar bear. They think it's a version of Beauty and the Beast. They haven't heard of East of the Sun, West of the Moon. So a lot of the emails I get accusing me of plagiarism are people that seem to be unaware it's a fairy tale. And then sometimes they're like, well, then you copied her version of the story, which I didn't. Hers is very different, and it came out actually while I was working on mine, so I have receipts if they need to be provided. But I was working on mine when this first came out, and I hurried and grabbed it as soon as I saw it because I was like, oh no, someone else is doing it. I hope mine is different. And as soon as I started reading, I'm like, this is very different from the angle I'm taking. I love hers, but it's very different from mine, but I do love hers. And then speaking of very different from mine, when I first met Sarah Beth Durst, I was like telling her look what I'm working on next. I have an arc here and stuff like that. And she was like, oh my gosh, my next book is also based on that same fairy tale. It's my favorite fairy tale. So we kind of bonded over being like the sisterhood of the traveling polar bear, whatever you want to call it. But her book, Ice, is very different and so good. And it is set at a like an Arctic research station in a modern setting, and is sort of upper, I think it was marketed as YA, but really it's sort of like new adult, if that were an actual thing. But it's a like a grad student doing research at an Arctic station. So she's older, she's the college age, and the polar bear is the whole thing's just very unusual, and I don't wanna spoil anything. So Ice by Sarah Beth Durst is so good. It's an excellent version of East of the Sun, West of the Moon. And it just occurred to me that I didn't pull out my copy of East of the Sun, West of the Moon with the gorgeous pictures by PJ Lynch to show to you, but oh well, that's for another time. So that is my fairy tale recommendations for this week. I hope you enjoyed that, and this video won't be too long. Um, and please like and subscribe if you like my videos. Thank you so much. Have a good week.